This is a bit of a side project that I've worked on the last couple of years, and it's a little bit different. Most of the work with panthers has been related to populations, home ranges, things like that. But just a wealth of data has been collected over the last 30 years now, and I have been getting interested in growth modeling, started off with frogs, and I've done some work with different people, grizzly bears, other black bears, other black bear populations in Park in Florida. And more recently, I was approached by someone to start working on a collaborative project with lions in Africa. So some of this is a little bit technical, it's like modeling, but I'm going to try to illustrate some of the implications of these models and how they might be used in the broader sense. Again, I want to thank a range of collaborators, Dave Honorado with Fish and Wildlife, Deborah Jansen, who most of you I'm sure are familiar with here. Numerous people have been collecting data over the years, some here, the agencies and the citizens of Florida. Some of the funding that goes to studying the panthers comes from my license plates. That's very appreciated. Okay, a little bit about growth. Growth in body dimension and mass, length or weight, is a fundamental element in the biology and ecology of all species that influences important life history traits such as minimum size or age of reproductive maturity. Growth trends are heritable and affected by environmental factors. Assumptions about puma growth, and actually, I should have said this before. I refer to puma in a broader sense. Of course, in Florida, we call it the Florida panther. But in a general sense, and in the general literature, we refer to puma because of the species puma. So I mean panther, but I speak in puma in generalities because some of the things I'm talking to are across the species. So assumptions about puma growth characteristics, reproductive productivity, energetics, and prey requirements have been based on mass growth curves. One cannot continuously measure changes in body size of an individual throughout life. You know, if you've ever had any children and you go to the doctor, they measure them all the time and they give you the little growth charts and everything. It's every 3 or 4 months and you see these little graphs grow. You know, maybe a whole lot to be measured, like my little daughter, every day, but you know, in a wild animal, you just can't do that. One way to get around that, a practical method, is using growth curves of a species if you know their body size and age measurement and fit those to algebraic models that describe how individuals grow as a function of age. Those models then give you opportunities to interpolate to those non-observed periods and describe that underlying growth pattern. These growth models are very useful in wildlife research because they can summarize this growth data with uniform model parameters that provide quantitative indices for comparisons of body size and growth rates. They can also be used to reveal variation caused by environment and facilitate comparisons between genders and among populations or the same population at different times. And in the application here, I'm going to illustrate how you can look at comparisons between genders to look at sexual dimorphism. This species is sexually dimorphic, with males larger than females. The causes responsible for both how and why the sexual dimorphism arises in the species is not well understood, but generally it's thought to be associated with interspecific and interspecific interactions. And I'll come back to that later. Now, there's been 2 other studies that have looked at growth modeling in puma in total. And in the past, this generalized Richard function has been the model of choice. However, when a particular model is chosen independently of data, because they just pulled this model off the shelf and said, we're going to use it. If that model is used independently to approximate the growth curve as the basis for inferences, uncertainty in this model selection is assumed to be 0. However, it sounds like we've got a few modelers in the room. We know that if model selection uncertainty is overlooked, then precision can be overestimated and accuracy of those predictions can suffer. So, despite this importance of testing concordances or reliabilities of different growth models fitted to the same data, very few studies have done this, and that's across species. So, one of the primary objective of what I'm going to present here was to use an information theoretic approach to evaluate 5 classical growth models in describing the body length, mass, size, and age growth curves to determine which best fit for panthers. Quickly, information data approach is basically involves a priori specifying a set of candidate models, and then model selection based on the principle of parsimony, according to criteria such as AKI, and estimation of the parameters and their precision. And parsimony is basically just, it's a trade-off between the complexity of a model, the number of parameters, and the accuracy of the model, and just coming up with a model that has the fewest number of parameters, but the most accurate. Then, using the best model, I compared the gender differences in the growth curves, and then looked at examining the ontogeny of sexual dimorphism. And ontogeny is just a fancy word for development. Okay. Panthers were captured and monitored with radio telemetry from about 82 to 2012 from biologists from Fish and Wildlife and the Park Service. And from this undertaking, standard body size and age data were recorded for 139 females and 155 males. And these were all panthers examined as kittens, because I'm talking about size and age. And these, only the kittens could we say, or could I say what the age was with any confidence. Hundreds of other panthers have been also captured, but they were captured, you know, as juveniles or adults, and the ages were estimated based on tooth wear, things like that. And I'll come back to that quickly in the end. So of those kittens, 27 of those females, 27 of the females and 21 of the males were eventually recaptured for radio counting later. So I had a sample of panthers that aged from 5 days up to 12 years old. This growth data included body length, mass, and age. Body length was basically the tip of the nose to the last vertebrae of the tail along the contour of the back. Body mass with calibrated spring scales. And then age was estimated from the movements of the radio-collared females, and then once to identify the den sites, and then once the den site was visited, looking at some characteristics of the kittens themselves: teeth wear, general size, pelage, whether eyes are open, things like that. Now, excluding data from recaptures in the growth curve construction would avoid potential autocorrelation. But doing so violates a basic assumption of random samples for each age class, because kittens would be excluded from future samples in older age classes. So therefore, I consider growth data from individuals in multiple years as independent, and I consider all panthers at a given age to be representative of that age, regardless of prior sampling. And that was done because of these reasons, but also to help give me a larger sample size. Because not all panthers were weighed, not all panthers were body length was measured. So we don't have complete data on every panther that's ever been panthered. Just to look at general morphology, I used a very simple mass length power function just to sort of look at the allometry. And the coefficient of this simple little equation is sort of a measure of rate of change. The exponent is a measure of the mass at unit length. And when it's exactly 3, it means pure isometric growth. When it's greater than 3 or less than 3, whether it's negative or positive. Positives are negative allometry. 5 growth models that I used in the study basically span the whole range of models that are out there. There's numerous ones, but these are very much the classical ones, the ones that are have been well used, applied widely in fishery science. But basically, I have models that represent a diminishing returns behavior, which is sort of essentially just an exponential curve, a monomolecular one, sigmoidal with a fixed point of inflection, and sigmoidal with a variable point of inflection. All these models have very similar properties, and the parameters have the same meanings. The monomolecular model is a very simple model. It basically describes a first-order reaction. The Gompertz one is an equation that describes self-limiting growth, where the rate decreases exponentially with time. The logistic model is a little bit more complex. It describes 3 stages of growth: an early exponential phase, where the growth rate is proportional to size; a linear phase, where the growth resources are devoted to maintenance; and then a diminishing growth phase as maintenance balances approach. The von Bertalanffy model is one of the older ones, and it was derived based on metabolic laws and the balance between anabolism and catabolism. Now, the Richard model, it wasn't derived by any of these underlying biological bases, and it was derived on an empirical basis as a theoretical advancement of some of those previous models that allows application to both exponential and sigmoidal potential models. Now, each model has a point of inflection, which is defined as the theoretical time of maximum growth, and they vary from 29.6 in the von Bertalanti up to 50% in the Bartareau. The point of inflection for the Richards model is flexible and occurs at any fraction of the asymptotic body size. Now, to compare the models, I used AKI criteria. I saw a couple of the tables up there use AKI. It's a very standard approach to compare and evaluate models. And then I used the AKI weights to evaluate the weight of evidence that a given model was the best within that suite of models. And that's another standard approach that's often used. I use pseudo R-squared and residuals of the data points about the fit models to look at their goodness of fit and their accuracy. And I use t-tests just to evaluate the differences between the model parameters, in this case between genders. Okay, into the results. Body mass increased with length. The gross and mass relative to length was nearly isometric with a negative element. The power functions didn't differ between males and females. The dashed line is female, dark points here is male, white points, open points here are females, dark points are males. And females have a slightly higher rate of change per mass per unit length, and we're slightly smaller per unit length. So I'm going to back a little bit on this axis. All the models were fitted pretty much without difficulty in the era of today with computers and things like that. You know, with little persistence, you can get most models to fit. But the complex logistic monomolecular and von Bertalanti models will fit a lot easier, only 7 to 14 iterations. The Richards model, which is a lot more complex, took a little bit more time, up to 56 iterations. Okay, each of the models have fit the data very, very well. That fit 98.7%, that's pretty good. Now for both the genders and the body size measures, length and mass, the von Bertalanti model performed the best. It had the largest pseudo R-squared values, the smallest AKI values, and the largest AKI weight values. The von Bertalanti model accounted for over 45, a little over 45% of the model weight. The rest of them was less than 35%. These are basically just the numerical expressions of the different models. So basically, if you wanted, and these size and age models is not, it doesn't predict a given animal. This is like for the population. So if you have an animal that you know its age and you wanted to get in the population what its mass might be or what its body length would be, you just plug age in there and it'll give you that value for the population as determined by the data that we have, all the data that we have. These are basically what the raw data and the curves that are derived, and you can see here that the early growth rate was rapid, reaching a maximum at the point of the growth curve and then declining to 0 as the asymptotic body length and mass was reached. The data for both genders fit the models better in these younger ages. It became more variable as they got older. You can see that these points are like right on the line, early phase of growth. As you get a little bit older, there's a lot more float there in the model phase. Looking at the predictions from some of the models, the estimated body length and mass at birth was 37.5 kilogram, 36.5 kilogram, which are, looking at values that we have in the literature, pretty close. The models estimated that the asymptotic body length was 9% longer, which is significant, and 33% heavier than for female, which was also significant. Looking at the maturing index, which is sort of an index of the rate of development over time, it's not implicitly a growth rate, but it's a relative value. And the results there indicated that the values for body length and mass were 6 and 21% larger for males, larger for females than for males. And there were significant differences in those growth rates, for mass and not for body length. Now, if you look at where the inflection point was placed, it was about 0.05 year, which is very young in both males and females, in females, and a little bit later in males. And then for body length, older maturity, it predicted for body length it was 4.6 years for females and 4.9 for males. And looking at the same thing for mass, it predicted the growth in body mass continued for a longer duration, and it predicted that females reached maturity 4.9 years and males about 1.6 years later. Now, getting into the section dimorphism a little bit, when you start looking at the data, it's the individual data, the raw data, and the models, is that this individual variation in body length and mass were greater than differences due to gender among panthers, ages less than 0.8 and 0.38. Looking at the accuracy of these models, the differences between the estimated and actual body length were plus or minus 6 centimeters, which is about 3% of the asymptote for females, and plus or minus about 5 centimeters, about 2% of the asymptote for males. And the same thing for body mass was within 3 and 2% of the asymptotes. Now, what does this all mean? Well, first of all, as I mentioned before, historically the inferences and the estimations of puma growth curves were based solely on the Richard models, but other models may be more appropriate for other populations. The growth curves can differ between genders and populations, and assessing multiple models through this information theoretic approach should be linked which model provides the best representation of the growth data. The application of these 5 models is really the first study of a puma in such detail. And it's also unique based on the sample that we had. Very few studies of pumas have had such a large sample of known age animals to work with. And the results suggest that when used for inferences on the panther, that this von Bertalanffy model did provide the least biased point estimates of growth in body length and mass as a function of age compared to the others. Okay, the different models produce variable results when fit into the growth data, as was expressed in EKE values and their weights. Although the Richard model is very flexible, it does present some certain disadvantages, such as a shape parameter that I didn't go into. It has an additional shape parameter. It really has no biological interpretation. Also, its parameters exhibit significant collinearity and are sometimes numerically unstable, and that was reflected in the number of iterations, the increased number of iterations to fit the models. So my conclusion on this is that while it has been used in previous studies, it was the most difficult to practically use in delineating the growth curves of our panthers, and in this study, certainly an example of over-parameterization. Using AKE criteria from the von Bertalanffy, it's a mouthful, model did have the best fit for both genders, and the AKE weights supported that as well. Now, go back to those curves. They were both sigmoidal shaped. It's a form of progressive development that is very common in almost all mammals. And failure of the generalized model to be more strongly correlated to the data than the von Bertalanffy does sort of point to this rational effect of fixing this point of inflection early on, about 29.6% of the asymptote in a panther growth curve. The estimated birth lengths and masses compare well to those reported in literature, indicating that the data set and models were suitable for describing this early postnatal growth. And the models also reliably explained the growth data and accurately depicted the body length of panthers as a function of age from these early years birth right up to age 12, which was the oldest cat that I had. The estimated age at the inflection points and of the length and mass was indicated the growth was most rapid during the early postnatal period, and then at the juvenile ages, and then most of a panther's lifetime was spent near asymptotic size. Of a 12-year-old cat, most of its growth was completed between 1 and 2 years. Now, pumas can consume up to 10 kilograms of prey in a single feed. So variation in body mass independent of age is expected in a cat that's captured, for the most part, in a random capture event. The cats that are captured when they are captured originally, although there's dogs after them and up and down and things like that, they are sort of captured at random. Once it's collared, then it's not necessarily a random because it's being tracked by radio. The differences that I found in this accuracy of the model of plus or minus a well within that range. So the variability that I did find could very well reflect just variation in stomach contents, such as the time it was last fed and the amount of food was actually consumed prior to being captured weight. So the models indicated that the males reached physical maturity at an older age than females, and significant differences in growth rates were evident for the mass, but not the length. Both genders continued growth in mass for a longer period than length. And estimated length, about 19 centimeters and 19 kilograms, about 9% or 33% heavier, is very consistent with what's been found in the literature of 10 to 30% across the species. And these asymptotic sizes predicted by these models were not the largest observed size attained by any individual in the population. But again, they represent that mean maximum size attained in the population as argued from this bone-birth-lengthening metabolic law. These growth curves indicate that both genders grew at about the same rate after birth, but there was well-defined body length and mass sexual dimorphism early on, about 0.19 a year or 0.39 a year. The fact that males ultimately grew to larger asymptotic body length and mass, the females of the same age reveals that males must have a greater absolute growth rate than females. Panther kittens are weaned by about 0.3 years, about 3 to 4 months, and independent and dispersal usually occurs a little over a year. Thus, those proximate causes of gender differences in the rate of body length and mass apparently begin to operate after offspring are weaned and continues right through family dissolution in adulthood. Female body mass is associated with resources for developing offspring, obviously. And variation in the age to reach that estimated minimum size at sexual maturity of 36.3 kilograms to some extent is related to differences in growth rates. That 36.3 kilograms was a figure first projected by a fellow who was studying cats up in Utah. And it's interesting, when I looked at the last weights of all female panthers at their first litter, the ones that we knew, it came up exactly the same, 36.3 kilograms. So it does seem like there's a minimum body mass that a female might need to reach before it can start having litters, not necessarily an age. So looking at using that and then going back to it, the growth models estimated that it took a panther 1.8 years to reach that 36.3 kilograms. And that did coincide really nicely with the 1.75 years when we know that individuals first reach sexual maturity. And we know that from radio collar cats, and we know that from some recent genetics work. So if we then step back a little bit more and then look at the model, at 1.8 years, a female is estimated to reach about 98% of her body length and about 94% of her body mass. Keep that in mind. Now looking at males, the first sexual encounters for males typically occur at about 3 years old based on radio collar data. But we know from genetics that males are breeding out there as early as 1.4 years old. And if you plug that 1.4 years back into the model, that predicts that they have reached about 95.9, about 96, and about 77% of their length and mass. So what does that mean? Well, it basically indicates that growth in body length of both of these genders was largely complete by the age of sexual maturity. But males continue growth in mass for longer duration than females after the onset of sexual maturity until that period of first and sexual encounters. These findings suggest that sexual dimorphism develops in part by constraints on female growth from energetic costs of reproduction, but males apparently allocate available energetic resources to grow faster and larger body size. Male reproductive stress is more variable than a female and depends on the ability to support competitors, acquire territory, and mate successfully. Interspecific male combat has been documented, inferring selection for larger male body size. Males may be sexually mature at a younger age, but they may not be large enough to outcompete rivals until they attain larger body size at an older age. Modeling of these puma growth curves is a useful tool for the derivation of body mass estimates at different ages at a population level. We have, Roy McBride does estimates of of counts of panthers out there. We have estimates of ages of other panthers, but we've not way before and things like that. So we can use these models to sort of retrospectively glean some of that information. Growth curves, as I mentioned in the background, are really important parts of bioenergetic models that can be combined with activity data, the telemetry information we have, to estimate food and space requirements of a population, and that's useful for examining range quality and carrying capacity. And just quickly how that is that they put cats on treadmills and things like that. So if I know what their activity patterns are, I can start to put a calorific value to that. And then knowing what calorific value, making some other assumptions about efficiencies of digestion and things like that, I can start to backtrack what their calorific need is from birth right through to adulthood. So if I know the demographics, the age and sex composition of a given population in a given area, say Corkscrew area or Big Cypress, I can then use this modeling framework to start to work out what might be the prey requirements. And then you can multiple iterations of it, whether it's a deer, whether it's a cat, whether it's 50% deer, 50%. The limitations are there isn't. It's just a matter of how your assumptions you put into it. So future data collection of body size and age at different developmental stages would enhance this understanding of ontogeny or sexual dimorphism. I'm gleaning some of these conclusions or theories from this model, but more specifically examine and test some of these more refined hypotheses. And this paper is currently in press. If you'd like a copy of it when it comes out, which has a lot more detail on different things, it's about the first issue, I believe, next year. If you, and just quickly, I don't mean to go on in time, all this has been on size and age models. And I mentioned that we have a really good data set for it. Panther is a little bit different than a bear and some other animals that we can age very readily by pulling teeth. So if you don't know the age of an animal, and we also have a large sample of panthers that we don't have the ages for, there is other modeling frameworks that you can use size and age data. It's a size increment data. And a follow-up study to this that Dave and Deb and I are currently reviewing is I've done just that. I've used size and age data to develop a new suite of models based on that size increment data. So maybe next year, if you're looking for another talk, I can come back and talk about that. But the results are more or less the same. It does give more accurate estimates of birth weights and things like that, and also a size and age model as opposed to the size increment model or growth increment model is different than a size and age model because it also gives you more variability for individual cats because I look at growth increments of individual cats, not this big sample for all the population. And if anyone has data that they're interested in looking at, I'd be more than happy to guide you or work with you on this because it's a really underutilized area of science, and I'd be more than